Hello there, my name is Dr. Christopher Pryor. I'm a lecturer in history at the University of Southampton. I'm very pleased today to be joined by Dr. Krista Petley, one of my colleagues in history at the University of Southampton, whose research expertise lies in the history of the slave trade and empire, particularly in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Krista, hello.
Hello.
In a different podcast, Krista and I were talking about the fact that there was a significant section of a British political and economic elite that gained a great deal from the perpetuation of the slave trade. So bearing that in mind, Krista, why did the British decide to abolish something that was so profitable to them and so important?
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, one of the things that is probably important to do is to note that there is a difference between two things here, the slave trade and slavery. And people do tend, and Jeremy Paxman does it in his book, they tend to conflate the two. And of course, as we have already talked about, these things were connected. The trade in slaves fed the plantations in the Caribbean with labour. But these are two things that were abolished at different times. The slave trade first, and then later on slavery. And that distinction, I think, is an important one to make. In terms of the reasons for ending the slave system, for dismantling all of this, there are so many, and this is an incredibly complicated historical topic. There's a great deal of ink that has been spilt on trying to make sense of and explain all of this. There are a number of different reasons for British people deciding that they wanted to dismantle this system of slavery that crisscrossed the Atlantic. Some of those are to do with cultural changes. People in Britain developing what's often referred to as a culture of sensibility. That's to say that they become interested in the plight of others, both at home and overseas. And this becomes something that is a marker of proper genteel behaviour, that the fact that I can feel sympathy for you or other human beings is something that goes to my credit. And this is something that becomes important to the British in the late 18th century. But it's not that alone. There's religious changes as well. An evangelical revival, a group of people who believe very strongly that religion shouldn't just be something that you do on a Sunday, shouldn't just be something that you do casually, but should shape your whole life. And these people who take their Christianity extremely seriously are at the forefront of the abolitionist movement. And it's a movement that you cannot understand without reference to religion and religious ideas. So those, I think, are two really significant transformations, a culture of sensibility and religious change. As well as that, the Enlightenment is something that is significant too. The ideas of people like Montesquieu at this period in the late 18th century, which are critical of slavery and slaveholding. As well as that, there are a number of short-term causes. One of them is the American Revolution. The American Revolution, for various reasons, seems to focus people's minds on this issue. The British seem to think in the 1780s, after they've lost their American colonies, as they need to find a new purpose for themselves in the world. And one of the ways that they try to do that is by looking at their own empire that remains and thinking about how they can reform it. And one way they decide to do that is to abolish the slave trade.
So that's then some of the broader geopolitical and cultural context in which abolition takes place. But of course it was also a political process, a domestic political process as well. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the nature of this process and how long did it take, for example?
Reading Jeremy Paxman's book, you could be forgiven for thinking that this is something that happens almost overnight, that the British become disillusioned with slavery and so they end it. And this is not the case. It's something that takes many, many years. It happens, in fact, over a generation. One of the first people to take an interest in slavery and want to criticise it, a character called Granville Sharp, helps win one of the first major abolitionist victories in Britain in 1772, a case concerning a slave called James Somerset. It's a complicated case, but the upshot of the case is that most slaves who are living in Britain itself consider that they've been freed by that verdict. So the Somerset verdict of 1772 in some respects can be considered a starting point for our story. It's only though after the American Revolution in the 1780s that a national abolitionist movement focused on the question of the slave trade gets underway. So it's in 1787 that we see a national committee trying to organise support for an end to the slave trade formed, and Thomas Clarkson, a famous abolitionist, is a part of that group as well as Sharp. 2 years later, in 1789, William Wilberforce makes his first parliamentary speech against the slave trade. But it's 18 years after that, 1807, that the slave trade is finally abolished. That's a long period of time. And then it's only in the 1830s that slavery itself is abolished. So we've got this incredibly long period of 60 plus years between the 1770s and the 1830s, over which the British agonise about the future of slavery in their empire and gradually dismantle what, as you said, had been an incredibly lucrative system for them.
So in essence then you're saying that the abolition of the slave trade was a very different thing to the ending of slavery.
That's right. The abolitionists, to begin with, focus on the slave trade. And so the campaign that begins in the 1780s and that is eventually successful in 1807 is aimed at just one part of the transatlantic British slave system. It's aimed at the trade in slaves, the transportation of enslaved people from West Africa across the Atlantic in British slave ships to the Americas. After that, slavery continued in the empire right through to the 1830s. So there are 800,000 enslaved men, women and children in the empire right up until the Emancipation Act is passed in 1833. And those people remain enslaved even after that act is passed until the end of the 1830s. 1838 is a final date at which those people finally become free. That's something that's sometimes overlooked, and Paxman in his book conflates these two things. But it's necessary for us to recognise that there's this great big time lapse between the ending of the slave trade and the ending of slavery. They're not the same thing.
From what you're saying, Paxman is quite correct when he's talking about how slavery was a disgraceful episode. He talks about it being a decision that was taken for purely altruistic reasons. You mentioned some of those potentially altruistic reasons earlier. Is that right?
Absolutely. I think the ending of slavery, particularly for those who have been kept in slavery, enslaved people, is an extremely positive moment in the history of the British Empire. How could it be otherwise? But it is also an incredibly complicated picture, and I think that this is something that doesn't come through very effectively in the narrative that Paxman gives us in his book. I think the argument that this is a decision taken for purely altruistic reasons is one that gives us something of a simplistic overview of these complicated events. So, for instance, someone like William Wilberforce is motivated by his religion, by his outlook that the world should become Christianized. And of course, somebody like that feels a great deal of sympathy and empathy for enslaved people. That's one of the reasons why a Wilberforce or a Thomas Clarkson or a Granville Sharp or a Hannah More becomes invested in the abolition movement. But they also hope through this to win converts to the church. One of the things that they see when they look to the West Indies is large numbers of people who could be converted to Christianity. So this is part of their motivation to spread the Gospels. Abolitionists continually make the point, as they're arguing to end the slave trade and end slavery, that there are all sorts of reasons for doing this, including the national interest. One of the things that they argue is that the plantations in the West Indies will be much more efficient without the slave trade. They argue that planters have become over-reliant on the slave trade, that it means that they're less willing to encourage slaves to reproduce on the plantations. And they argue that in fact what you can do by ending the slave trade is make slavery better, make slavery more efficient and more productive. So at that stage where abolitionists are focused just on the trade, actually part of their argument is we must abolish the trade in slaves in order to make slaveholding in the Caribbean more effective. When it comes to ending slavery itself, similar kinds of arguments are made. The argument is that free labour will be more economically productive than slave labour, because the notion is that people working for a wage will work harder than slaves would work. So to say that this is something that's abolished entirely only for altruistic reasons, I think overlooks those kinds of strands of the abolitionist debate, which are really quite important in persuading government ministers. These are hard-minded people with their national interests at heart. If you want to persuade government ministers to abolish something like slavery, you have to have some very strong practical arguments for doing that.
One of the things that Paxman goes on to talk about later on in the book is a strong sense that the British have in the 19th century of a sense of duty, of a sense of commitment to the civilising mission. Now, you're saying that the British ending of slavery, even if it was for mixed motivation, it was a good thing, a progressive decision. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you think about the idea of the ending of slavery being a progressive decision, and whether it helped give the British Empire a sense of duty then that it took forward into the 19th century.
I think that's right. Anti-slavery does help to underpin what many of us describe as a Victorian sense of civilising mission in the empire of the 19th century. Like Paxman says in his book, David Livingstone in Africa, this sort of famous figure of the 19th century empire, is famous in part because of his commitment to anti-slavery. So that's, I think, an important point to make. There's another side to this story that we don't really see in the book, that many of the arguments that abolitionists make in favour of emancipation are that plantations without slavery will be better places, and in particular that they will be more efficient, that the output of sugar will go up. That doesn't happen. It's something that didn't occur after the ending of slavery. And people in Britain very often blamed former slaves for that. The argument was that former slaves were asking for wages that were too high. The arguments often went that former slaves were too lazy to produce sugar on the plantations. Of course, what was actually happening was that former slaves were unwilling and unhappy to work in places where they'd formerly been so rigorously oppressed, and where many of the same management practices that were seen during slavery were continued. But what you get as a result of that are arguments about race that build up in Victorian Britain. The stereotype of lazy black people that had so often been mobilised by slaveholders in defence of slavery takes on a new life and actually feeds in then to 19th century varieties of racism that continue to blight the lives of those former slaves. And it's not unsurprising, perhaps, therefore, that we see uprisings, riots and protests in the post-emancipation Caribbean, the most famous being one at Morant Bay, which is an incredibly important episode in the Victorian Empire and one that's not mentioned at all in the book, but an episode through which many of these arguments about race are focused. The Morant Bay Rebellion becomes an extremely important focal point for those kinds of disputes and debates within Britain about the successes and the failures of slave emancipation in the Caribbean.
Thank you very much indeed, Krista.
Thank you.